In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a really quick and hacky assistant within Glide using the BuildShip platform and leveraging the OpenAI Assistant API. So the goal is to be able to do something like this, to be able to ask it questions about my Google Sheet and get information about it. So I'm going to ask it who had the highest sales. Oop, if I can type. Fire that off. And just for reference, this is the Google Sheet that I'm expecting it to call and look at. So I'm guessing, or I'm assuming, it should return back Frank because they had $16,000. And I'll show you, of course, how this is actually set up. There we go. So that's the goal. Now let's go ahead and set this up. Now I'm going to show you first how it's set up in Glide, and then I'll show you the BuildShip side of things. But before I do any of that, I want to give you just a quick overview of what this looks like, because it's really very simple. And again, this is probably not what you want if you're setting up an actual assistant conversation-like interface, but just to get things done, prototype level MVP out the door, this is pretty simple setup. So user submits a message, that message sits inside of your Glide table, and then you're firing off a workflow trigger that's basically going to send an API call to BuildShip, and it's going to say send this information via a post API call that has the user's message and the thread ID. And then BuildShip is going to take care of, once we've actually set it up, of course, it's going to take care of sending that information to the OpenAI assistant for us. And again, it'll send the user message and the thread ID. After that, that information will get put right back in our Glide table, which we can do whatever we want with it. So that's the basic setup of this. So coming back to Glide, again, you can see the columns that I have down here. First, I have the user message, AI's response, the thread ID, and then I have a couple of other things in here. I have display state. Over here, I have a row JSON, and I usually make it a habit that in every table I add this in for any information that I may want to send via an API or that I want to easily access in other contexts. But here you can see all I have is the user message and the thread ID, because this is going to become the body of my API call. So this is the table setup. That's it. On the layout, here all I have is just displaying the AI's response. That's just referencing that same column, the one we looked at down here. And then this is just a text input that's putting information into the user message column. And then you'll notice this is where I have that display state for loading. And that's going to be what allows me to put this text input into a load state. Then the last part is the actual action that gets triggered, so the workflow. So over here I have a start chat workflow, and all it's really doing here is basically just sending an API call out and making a few other adjustments. So the first thing it's doing is that display state, it's setting it to loading true. It's firing off my API call, and I'll show you how all this is set up here in a moment. And then when that API call comes back, because it's just basically going to be a giant blob of JSON, I need to parse it out so that I can get first the thread ID and then the actual response from the AI. And after that, I'll just wipe out the value from the user's message and set the loading state to false so that the text input is active again. So nothing too crazy going on here. It's really just the 3 columns and 1 workflow. So now I'll show you the BuildShip side of things. So over on this side, this is the BuildShip setup. Now, it's really not too much going on here other than the fact that there's kind of 3 steps. The information coming in, the OpenAI assistant that's going to be doing something with that information, the tools that the OpenAI assistant is using, which we'll talk a bit more, and then just sending it right back to Glide. And to show you the setup here, I'm actually going to create this from scratch to show you how easy it is. So the first thing we need to do is set up the REST API call. So this is what's going to allow us to get an API endpoint that we can then have set up in Glide. So I'm going to say REST API call. We'll just leave that as is. And there's really nothing you need to change in here. Now I have my URL here. I can copy that. And if I come back to the Glide side of things, go to my workflows, open the API setting, and I'm going to replace the endpoint with the one I just created. Now, just a quick note on the setup here. So I do want it to be a post call because that's the kind of API call we're sending off. The content type, I need to be an application/JSON, and we actually can see that briefly here, the content type. And the body, I want to be that row JSON column that I created in my table. So this is the one that has the user message and the thread ID. And then lastly, when that API call sends or returns its data, I want it to put it in the AI response column, because this is also, even though it's going to be a giant blob of JSON, I'm going to parse those out so that they're in the right spot. All right, so coming back to BuildShip, the next thing I want to do is set my inputs. So in this REST API call, what I'm doing is just basically sending a body. That's this piece right here within Glide. And so what I'm going to do is get data from trigger, REST API call, body. And you can definitely get more specific so that you can actually say specifically user message if you want thread ID. It does make it a little bit easier to reference as you're going through your workflow, but for the sake of the demo, we're just going to go with that. The next thing I'm doing now is adding an OpenAI assistant. Now there's a bunch of other stuff you can do in here. There's also a Anthropic assistant, which I believe they actually recently released some things related to document retrieval that could be interesting. But for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to use the OpenAI assistant. All right, now the one thing to note is before you can actually use this, you do have to have this set up in your OpenAI account. So you need to have a API key already, and then you also need to have your assistant ID. You need to create the assistant within OpenAI. Now, BuildShip does have a lot of great documentation to set this up, and I would actually recommend just using one of their templates straight up because they're great to use right out of the box. But for the sake of this demo and to show you how simple, we're just going to set it up. So I already have my API key set up. I'm just going to set the assistant demo. And then let me grab my assistant key. Right, here's my assistant key. And then we need to set our instructions. Now for the instructions, I'm actually just going to paste in something I already have. So this is a prompt from the other demo that we just saw. Now a few things to note in here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So here's the baseline that I'm telling it, your role, this is your task. You definitely probably want to have something more robust than this so that it's clear on its instructions. And especially because you're going to be using tools. The Assistant API has the ability to leverage other APIs and take actions based on the instructions you give it. So you want to be very clear with those instructions and the tools that you're giving it. So in this case, this is probably not a great one, but just to give you an example, use the action get sheets, and that way it can retrieve the information. I'm also giving it the specific Google Sheet URL because that's the tool we're using. You shouldn't have to, but just for the sake of the demo, I'm putting that in there now. Then the next thing we want to do is the user prompt. So we need to be able to tell it, this is the message that the user is sending. In order to access that information, we're going to go body that references this body input that we had set up here. And then we're going to say body.userMessage. That way we're referencing the exact user message input that we put in our glide table back just to show you right here. And that's where that's coming from. The other thing we want to do as well is set the thread ID to make sure that we're maintaining that same conversation. So again, we'll do the same exact thing. We'll just go body, dot, can't type, thread ID. You want to make sure it matches exactly with what you're sending back over here. So a lot of times you're probably better off just copying and pasting, making sure that you're keeping those in line. So at this point, the assistant's set up. It's ready to go. Now, what we want to start doing is providing it the tools. And so this is where things get really interesting because you can provide it just about everything in here. You can even create your own custom nodes if you want with your own custom code and have it run those. But for this example, we're just going to go Google Sheets. We'll say get sheets. And since I already have the URL in here, I'm actually just going to grab this. We'll paste that in there. And we're going to say sheet 1. And again, this is just referencing this sheet right here, this data, and this sheet name. All right, now we want to test it. So we can do that by clicking up here under test. And because I've chosen specifically to set it up using the body, all I'm going to do is basically just say user message. And this is, again, the name of the input that we set up in Glide. And I'm going to say who had the highest sales. All right, close that, test the flow. And what's great about BuildShip is that there's a lot of error logging and different ways to see where the problem is coming from, if there is one. So while that's loading, I can show you down here. Once this finishes running, you can see it actually gives me a log of all the error, of all the actions and errors and everything that's happening. I won't go through that right now, but because that can be a lot. But here we go. Here's our response. So this is the response that you're going to get sent to Glide. You can see there's a lot of information here that you probably don't care for. And so the only thing you're going to be doing is coming back to our workflow here, opening this up. These pieces right here are going to be parsing out this object. So for example, the first thing I'm telling it to do is to parse out the thread ID, and that's what's going to pull this piece right here and put it in the thread ID column. And then the second one, again, over here is looking for the AI response, and it's going to grab this and put it in the AI response column. All right, so at this point, this is ready to ship. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit ship. And just to confirm, I'm gonna double check my API call over here, make sure I have the right endpoint. And I'm just gonna copy and paste it over here again, even though it probably is the same. There we go. All right, so this is now live. Let's see what's going on. Who had the lowest sales? If all went well, we should get a response here. And let's double check. Sure enough, 12,000. So that's it. That's pretty much the whole setup in what, about 5 minutes. Um, yeah, you can see we set up the API calls in BuildShip. We have the information going back and forth between BuildShip and Glide, and it's reading from our Google Sheets, and we're able to interface with it on the Glide side. So that's kind of the basic overview. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, definitely please feel free to reach out.